Yeah, I would like to thank Chris for the sharpness of his introduction and its brevity, and which I appreciate very, very much. Yes, no, definitely. And I mean, it's always a pleasure to come back here. This time, as you know, Sarah and I came not only as usual, but we brought the entire family. Yes. And so Anil and Leah are they might get bored at some point. So if you see them leaving the room, don't be offended. And I would like to say how grateful I'm with Nemanja. I don't know where he is, but he's in the back, yeah. Look, there are many questions that confront our, not only our world at large, but our epoch. I would really like to think in terms of epochs. But two of them I consider extremely urgent. Tonight's conversation, because that's how I see it, will be devoted to those two questions. What are they which haunt us and might haunt us for most of this century? The first is the question of life futures. I will explain in a moment what I mean by life futures. The second, which is to a large extent entangled with the first, the second is that of the future of reason. So life futures on the one hand and the future of reason on the other. It seems to me that we are called upon to grapple with these very urgent issues at a time, of course, when humanity seems to have finally come to the realization that absent a significant adjustment to how we conduct our lives, parts of the earth will likely become close to uninhabitable or inhospitable to life in the near future. It's an awakening to consciousness, if you want, that wasn't there, let's say, 25 years ago. Or if it were, it was marginal. The novelty is that that awakening to this consciousness is growing. And it's growing not only in major parts of the north, it's also growing in huge chunks of the south. Indeed, if we are to believe the most recent studies of the trajectories of the Earth system, we may well be fast approaching a kind of planetary threshold beyond which the Earth might be irreversibly turned into what many call a hothouse. And I would like you to keep in mind that notion of a hothouse that is a house unfit, not only for human habitation, but a house incapable of sustaining any form of life. And as far as we are concerned, a house where the human body, which after all is arguably the last thing each of us owns in proper will be basically or literally cooked to death from inside out in an endless process of radiation, of calcification and petrification. Now, for a long time, the human race, I mean, it's a term, it's an old term, human race, which somewhat has fallen into obsolescence at some point. I can't tell you exactly when, but it used to be used until it disappeared. I think it's time to bring it back. So the human race has been concerned with how life emerges. It has been concerned about its spatial distribution. It has been concerned with the conditions of its evolution and resilience. And the life in question has mostly been life on Earth. It has been terrestrial life, which doesn't mean that here and there were no debates on the afterlife. But it was precisely the afterlife. It wasn't about life as such. It was about the after, what comes after, especially in theological discussions. So the first suggestion I would like to make tonight is that a shift is underway in relation to the terms in which we are now confronting the question of life futures. That we are not framing this issue in the exact terms we used to. We are framing it now in different terms. Today, the key question is not only how life can be reproduced, how it can be sustained, how it can be made durable, how it can be preserved and universally shared. Increasingly, the core question is framed in terms of the conditions under which it ends and how it ends. So we have moved from that long cycle of intellectual life when the main preoccupation was, okay, where does it come from? What are its seeds? What are the seeds of life? How did it come to emerge? How did it evolve? Or, for that matter, co-evolved? How can we maintain it? And so forth and so on. We have moved from that paradigm to a new one whenever life is invoked, it's in terms of how it ends. And that seems to me to be pretty peculiar to this epoch of ours, and it will suffuse this epoch, will be confronted with that manner of raising the question of life for the foreseeable future. Now, when I say the conditions under which life ends, I do not only refer to human life, but to what we could call the life of everything. The life of everything, the life of all living things. That wasn't the case recently. It wasn't the case that the life of everything was, let's say, the broad configuration under which these matters were dealt with. When somebody like Foucault talks about biopolitics, the politics of life, it's not really about the life of everything. It's about one form of life which has to do with human life. So, in other words, human life is less and less considered separately. It is increasingly seen within the prism of other forms of life. That's the first observation I would like us to keep in mind. The second remark requires a bit of an elaboration, and I know that, it's a bit late, but just hold on a little bit and you'll see where I'm trying to go. The shift in the terms in which we now frame the question of life futures is partly the result of recent findings in a number of fields, some of them new, others ancient. Fields such as astrobiology, which is a new field, fields such as planetary science, fields such as physical cosmology. And these are not fields many of us in the humanities are used to traffic in. And it's time for us to open those windows if we are to catch up with where the debates on life are moving. I invoke these disciplines for a number of reasons. The first is to suggest that if life used to be the preserve of disciplines such as biology or evolutionary anthropology, this is no longer the case. In fact, just an aside, part of what we are witnessing broadly is a general redistribution among disciplines. For instance, in the humanities, we used to believe that questions of agency, questions of intentionality, a whole set of questions like that were our preserve. That if any meaningful statement was to be made on matters such as intentionality, it had to come from the humanities. Part of what we have been witnessing over the last quarter of a century is the fact that that is no longer the case. A number of topics or themes we consider to be ours have now been taken over by other disciplines, neurology, evolutionary biology, cognitive psychology. There have been a redistribution, general redistribution of the maps. And the question of life has not been immune to, let's say, this general redistribution in the sense that it's no longer just the kingdom of biology. So that's the first reason why I invoke these disciplines. The second reason is that astrobiology, planetary sciences, and physical cosmology have profoundly contributed to decentering the terrestrial. We are hearing a lot about decentering the human, but there are so many decenterings that have to occur. Decentering the West, but also decentering the terrestrial, and in so doing, extraterrestrializing, so to say, humans' interrogation on life and its futures. And now when we say life and its futures, we also imply life and its limits, life and its horizons, to use a term Sarah introduced in our seminar yesterday. That is, how these frontiers of life are shifting and expanding and contracting. Now, what findings are we referring to? Let me mention three. For instance, the first is the discovery of recently of biological organisms in the world's driest deserts, as well as in subglacial lakes and even in hot springs. That is the discovery of forms of life in places objectively recognized not only as unfit for human habitation, but as fundamentally incapable of sustaining life as such. What has happened is that, in fact, thanks to research done in some of these disciplines, we are discovering that that's not the case. That in fact, forms of life can survive and even thrive, including in contexts that are extreme. So the return, therefore, of this category of the extremity and all of that, which is prevalent in some political discourses, but which has not at all been the object of proper philosophical interrogation. When we refer to the extremes, what do we mean? What is it that we mean by situations of extremity? So that's the first kind of finding. The second is the discovery of specific forms of microbes that are called airborne microbes, most of which have been captured in the stratosphere. Not on Earth, but in the stratosphere. And the third is the discovery of the fact that a number of microscopic animals are capable of suspended animation. Suspended animation meaning that they can be maintained in a state of existence without having to breathe for long stretches of time. Yesterday, Sarah was giving us a set of reflections on the question of air and breathing, on these elemental forces that are, implicated in the many ecological changes we are witnessing. And all of us were somewhat recognizing the fact that air, breathing, these are two processes intimately related to at least human life. But what we are seeing now is that, in fact, when we consider these new discoveries, the connection is not necessary. You can be alive without breathing. I mean, you, not you, the microbes I'm talking about. Whether that can be extended to humans, that's an open question. Now, all these findings and many others have led, of necessity, to a reassessment of a number of received notions, beginning with the very notion of life itself, but also notions such as what is a habitable environment, questions of habitation, questions of habitability, questions of housing in the philosophical sense of the term, questions of, as I'm trying to push it, shelter, housing, shelter, trying to push this question of inhabitation or habitation beyond the legacy we received from Heidegger, for instance, for whom habitability and dwelling were somewhat in a state of intimate relationship. So, received notions of habitable environment we have been forced to reassess them. We are forced to reassess what it means to be alive. But even more importantly, these new findings are forcing us to look for novel ways of envisaging, as I said, what life in the extremes, which is likely to become a new planetary condition, and living in the extremes, what it might actually look like. And as I was arguing, I think this afternoon in our seminar, That's where places like Africa become really interesting. In fact, they become the laboratory where forms of life in the extremes have been experimented with for a very, very long time. And therefore, it becomes interesting to look into, let's say, that archive, which Africa, or that laboratory, to see how it is that places considered to be unfit for human life have been, in fact, the soil for experimentations in how to make life in unlivable conditions. And how to make life become resilient in those environments, extreme in many, many different forms, in political form. I mean, we were joking at dinner with our American friends. I mean, we're laughing at the expense, which is good, I mean, to laugh at the powerful, telling them, oh, now you have we didn't know you, all this time you had a Latin American or African envy. The envy being what? To be ruled by a tin pot dictator. And now we see America has finally elected an African or Latin American president. So you have political extremes of that kind, but also other kinds of extremes, including, as we will see soon, extreme weather. So once again, this concept of the extreme as a key, let's say, context out of which life has to be made. The last observation I would like to share has to do with the fact that overall, these debates about how life on Earth can be reproduced and sustained and under what conditions it ends, these debates are forced upon us, as I said, by the epoch itself. What kind of epoch? An epoch characterized as it is by at least two key factors. One, I mentioned it, the impending ecological catastrophe on the one hand, and on the other hand, technological escalation. So I would now like to make some comments on this idea of technological escalation. I just want to remark briefly that I'm not using technological acceleration. I'm talking about escalation, like in a conflict, because escalation, acceleration are not exactly the same thing. But we can talk about that later if you want. So I want to offer some more extensive comments on what I call technological escalation. First of all, it's a fact that unprecedented numbers of human beings in the north, of course, but also in the south, are today embedded in increasingly complex technostructures, which are not exactly the same everywhere, but which are a reality everywhere under different guises. These complex technostructures, we now know, are increasingly intervening in the dynamics of the Earth system on a planetary scale. That we know. The other thing we know is that this has led to the transgression of what is known in these domains as planetary boundaries, boundaries such as those related to anthropogenic climate change, those which are related to degenerative land use change, accelerated biodiversity loss, perturbation of the global biogeochemical cycles of nitrogen, for instance, or phosphorus, or even the creation and release of novel entities such as nanoparticles and genetically engineered organisms such as those studied by the likes of Jonathan Donges and a number of scientists. And that's one thing. The other thing is that over the last decade in particular, numerous algorithms have been developed. What many do not know is the fact that many of these algorithms are inspired, in fact, by the natural world and by ideas of natural selection and evolution. That is not known as much as it should. Such is the case, for instance, of genetic algorithms, which themselves are a subset of evolutionary algorithms that mimic actions inspired in biological operators such as cells. And these genetic algorithms, of course, seek to, among others, to optimize the responses to the problems of their environments by self-generating and encompassing processes of mutation and natural selection. At least if we are to believe those who are doing research on matters such as this. And here I'm relying in particular on the work of Pasquinello, who teaches in Germany. So it seems to me, I mean, as Margarita Mendes powerfully argues in a piece called Molecular Colonialism, that a shifting redistribution of powers between the human and the technological is fast unfolding. As I say redistribution of powers, I'm not saying that the technological is replacing the human, which has been a big anxiety, I mean, in Western philosophy for a long time, although maybe that's the road we are engaged in. On the other hand, technologies are increasingly tied both metabolically and reproductively in complex networks of extraction and predation. So we're not only talking about genetics, not only talking about natural selection. We are also talking about extraction and predation, which connects them, of course, more directly to the workings of capitalism. Now, if you read that piece by Margarita Mendes, which I highly recommend, which is called Molecular Colonialism, Mendes shows the extent to which, for instance, the genetic codes of humans, of plants and animals are being cracked and, of course, publicly disseminated. But what is really interesting in that piece is the way she shows how this, in turn, is giving way to an exponential rise in biological patents. And the human genome, for instance, is in the process of being privately owned. Can you imagine that? All of this suggests one major point I would like to put on the table tonight, which is that life itself, what is known in these debates as life itself, not life as socially constructed or culturally constructed, but life as such, is more and more perceived as a commodity to be replicated under the volatility of market consumption. And this is really new. It wasn't the case, for instance, in the 40s, 50s. It wasn't. This is a new phenomenon, both scientifically and politically. And thousands of new molecules whose behavior, that's another, just to keep giving you, let's say, examples, whose behavior cannot be predicted, are being produced and released into the ecosystems. Whether one deals with seeds or chemicals or herbicides, GMOs and pesticides, all of which are being patented, not by everybody, but by a handful of multinationals. I don't even mention the widespread genetic modification of key elements in the food chain, with corporations now intervening directly in the natural cycles of life and ecosystems. I'm sure these are things you have heard about, so I won't. I will stop the examples there. All of this has, of course, tremendous consequences. I just want to mention one, the fact that as these algorithmic forms of intelligence are growing, most of the times in parallel with genetic research, a point we tend to lose sight of, the integration of algorithms and big data analysis in the biological sphere, that's the point I'm making, it brings with it a greater belief in techno-positivism. That in fact we have entered a new phase of human history which can be characterized as the age of technolatry. Technolatry is a term that I invent and which is made on the model of idolatry. Technolatry being the turning of technology into a form of idolatry or idol. So this is going hand in hand, of course, with the expansion of statistical thought, regimes of assessment of the natural world, and modes of prediction and analysis which treat matter and life itself as computable entities. That's the other additional novelty, that believe that we can compute life. And this is also really new. And it raises, I'll end up with that later, but I can say it now, the question of whether or not there is anything that might be incomputable. The question of incomputability of Heidegger, again, incalculability, or whether everything can be computed and calculated. So, the idea that life itself might be an open, a nonlinear, and exponentially chaotic system, that idea is increasingly under siege. And that is new. Because we have relied for a very long time, many centuries, on that idea that life was something that was open-ended, which made it, of course, prone to accidents, to things unexpected, but which also gave it, endowed it with numerous potentialities, which opened it up to the idea of futurity because of the open-endedness precisely. And we accepted the fact that it was exponentially chaotic. But that idea is increasingly under siege. And it is under siege because the belief now is not only that the market is the primary mechanism for the validation of truth, the belief is also that since markets themselves are increasingly turning into algorithmic structures, the only useful knowledge today is supposed to be algorithmic. So the entrance into a kind of tautology, which indeed rests on not the consideration of actual human beings with body, history, and flesh, but on the premise that big data, statistical inferences are all that count. Nothing else counts. And both big data and statistical inferences are mostly derived from computation. So the computational as precisely this crash, this moment of structural collusion, whose effect is to write everything in and to leave nothing outside. And the famous dictum, there's no outside. The end of any outside. So that's one way to, let's say, interpret what I call technological escalation. Now, let me then move to the third moment of the remarks I wanted to make, and this has to do with reason. The fact that reason itself is now on trial. I think that these are also times when many are gradually coming to the realization that maybe reason has reached its limits. And I say it, I have stopped many times and tried to find out whether this was just a hyperbolic statement or a provocation, a futile provocation, but it's not. So maybe just to nuance it a bit, let's just agree that there's a time when reason is on trial. I will not go back to recall the extent to which reason as a faculty we used to recognize in humans and in humans alone, although of course some were more human than others that we know. So it was in that sense unequally redistributed among humans. But today, reason is on trial, at least in two ways. On the one hand, it is increasingly replaced and subsumed by instrumental rationality. I will refer you here to, of course, the work, I think it was Horkheimer, The Eclipse of Reason. There have been many debates on the fate of reason in modernity. So we have to keep them in mind. But the question of the reduction of reason to instrumental rationality has been with us it's part of the critique of the Enlightenment, at least in the works of the likes of Adorno, Horkheimer, and a number of others. What we have to add to that critique is the fact of reason being reduced to procedural or algorithmic processing of information. I mean, that is not part of the Adornian or Horkheimer critique, if only because when they were writing, the kind of technological escalation I was referring to had not yet happened. But if we want to pursue that line of argument, then we have to add the fact that now it's not simply that reason as a faculty has been reduced to instrumental rationality, it's also that it is reduced to the algorithmic processing of information. In other words, the logic of reason is morphing from within machines and computers and algorithms, in the sense that the human brain is no longer the privileged location of reason. The human brain is being downloaded into nanomachines, is actually being downloaded into nanomachines. And in that sense, an inordinate amount of power is gradually being ceded to abstractions of all kinds. Old modes of reasoning are being challenged by new ones, most of which originate through and within technology in general, and digital technologies in particular, as well as through the top-down models of artificial intelligence. As a result, techne, the Greek term techne is becoming the quintessential language of reason. If you want, its only legitimate manifestation. Furthermore, instrumental reason, or reason in the guise of techne, is increasingly weaponized. Time itself becoming enveloped in the doing of machines, and machines themselves not simply executing instructions or programs, but starting to generate complex behavior and execute complex decisions. So what I mean by all of that is that what we are seeing is a computational reproduction of reason. And the computational reproduction of reason has made it such that reason is no longer, or is a bit more than just the domain of human species. We now share it with various other agents, reality itself being construed mostly via statistics, metadata, modeling, and mathematics. That's the technical side of the argument. But there's a political side of the argument in the sense that many are turning their back to reason in favor of other faculties and other modes of expression and cognition. And you have calls to do that. They are calling, for instance, for a rehabilitation of affect and emotions. For instance, and if you look around in many of the ongoing political struggles of our times, passion is clearly trumping reason. And confronted with complex issues, feeling and acting with one's guts, meaning viscerally, rather than reasoning, is fast becoming the new norm. It's something that has led a number of critics to reread in old texts, particularly on Krauss, Freud, Gustave Le Bon, Canetti. You see, return to these thinkers precisely because of our entry into a new age of viscerality. Viscerality on the part not only of the dominant, but also on the part of the subalterns. So, I'm now moving towards the end. Where does this leave us? Where does this leave us? Let me just recall briefly in quick sentences what I think we are facing. First, as the new century unfolds, we are increasingly surrounded by multiple and expanding wave fronts of calculation. Calculation, computation have become our condition. That's our environment, that's our existential condition. Calculation is becoming all that counts, if you want. More and more, these wave fronts incorporate life and matter, as I have just argued, into systems of abstraction and machinic reasoning, reason understood in a purely procedural manner. So in other terms, what we are witnessing is the generation of new automated couplings between matter, machines, and human beings, and of course, life. So if we want to rehabilitate reason, which I believe that, of course, we have to keep articulating a critique of reason, of what has been done in the name of reason. A critique of the unreason of reason. Because reason has been unreasonable in many instances. And people who look like me, if you want, have more than one reason to suspect reason, or to put on trial that which was done in the name of reason, which was in fact totally unreasonable. The ways in which reason became unreasonable the moment it had to face people like me. I don't want to call upon Hegel once again and what he writes, but he wouldn't be alone. All of them can't, hardly anyone within the canon escapes that syndrome. That the moment you face Africa, you lose reason, automatically. And I'm not exaggerating, just read the text. People who are called rational beings, the moment they encounter Africa, it's over. They are into delirium. So we have reason to put reason on trial when it comes to matters like that. But at the same time, we have to rehabilitate it. We have to reanimate reason. Especially in relation to some of the key urgent challenges I have been talking about. That the work of reason now for instance, is to allow for different modes of seeing and measuring to appear. Which doesn't mean that we are against measurement as such, or calculation as such. But is it true that there is only one way of calculating? Is it true that there is only one way of counting, or one way of measuring, as we are made to believe as I speak? And the task of reason, the new task of reason, is precisely to help to make those distinctions. It is to help human subjects to properly identify the threshold that allows us to make distinctions between the calculable and the incalculable, the quantifiable and the unquantifiable, the computable and the uncomputable. It is to help understand that technologies of calculation, computation, and quantification do present us with one world among many actual and possible worlds. Therefore, as Pasquinelli argues, different modes of measuring will open up the possibility of different aesthetics, for instance, of different politics, of inhabiting not just the earth, but the universe, the cosmic universe, which is back. That, in fact, when you look at the kind of literature I was referring to, scientists themselves are now recognizing that there is something that surpasses the human and contains the human at the same time. Which means that the world is not limited to the earth, for instance. That there is a more expansive world which calls for a renewed cosmic imagination. That cosmology is back. The difference is that it's not brought back by humanists, it is brought back by scientists themselves. So, the new task of reason is indeed to accompany and supplement and release, let's say, a dimension of our being which is speculative, which pertains to what I have called cosmic imagination. So that's a set of, let's say, openings I would like to end with. Now, let me add one or two other things. This has to do with the fact that the other task, or maybe one last task of a new reason, if you want, is to help us indeed to oppose the kind of epistemic hegemony which tends to reduce life and the earth to a financial problem, to a problem of financial value. The moment I convoke cosmic imagination, you see immediately that one of the work it does is to go counter to the false cosmologies which aim at reducing life not only on Earth but also life in the universe to a big financial problem. I think I'll end it there. Thank you very much.